Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of Bento Bureau, the show where we talk about Japan from an international perspective. I'm your host, as always, Basim Hijazi, or Buzz for short, and with me, as always, my fellow co host, Bastian Harth. Guten Tag, my friend.
Guten Tag, Bas. Salam alaikum, I guess. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I have not been learning German, if it wasn't obvious, but I'm really excited about today's episode. What do you think, Bastian? Are you excited?
I'm pretty excited because it kind of gives us a summary of what we've been talking about with our previous guest. Because today, Tim can really share a whole history of what has been going on in the Japanese startup world. And I'm quite excited to hear what he has to share with us.
That's really true. We've been doing a lot of episodes on Japan startups, haven't we? And I'm not even
Yeah.
sure if that was sort of intentional, but there was just a lot to cover in this space because there's so many interesting individuals. And today's episode is sort of the magnum opus, if you will, the cream of the crop to tie it all together, it seems. But it is my absolute pleasure to jump into this grid here and introduce this episode's guest. He's lived in Japan for more than 25 years and has started four companies in his time. He's led, many more companies through Japan's market entry, and of course, above else, many of you know him as the founder and host of the 6-year long-running Disrupting Japan podcast, which we are big fans of here at Bento Bureau. Tim Romero, thank you so much for joining us today on Bento Bureau.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this.
That's really great to have you here. I remember when we started our podcast so many years ago. It wasn't 6 years ago. I think it was around 4 or 5, maybe now. Correct me if I'm
Right.
wrong, Bastian. But I remember Disrupting Japan used to always just pop up in the related episodes, even though we never did anything about startups back then. But we've always been, familiar of the show ever since back then. So it's sort of surreal to have you on the show today. So thank you so much. And I think I want to start this off just by asking you a little bit about yourself and get to know you a bit more before we jump into startups. What's your story, Tim? What brought you to Japan more than 25 years ago?
Well, actually, I've moved back and forth a couple of times. In fact, I've left Japan for good twice, but I'm still here. Uh, the very first time I moved to Japan was actually in 1988. I came to Japan as a professional musician. A Japanese record company brought me over, and I don't know. I mean, the late '80s, the bubble. It was a really fun time to be in Japan. But my music career was short, even by Japanese standards. And after a couple years, I was kind of, my career was stalled, my music was stalled. Moved to LA to do the music thing there. That didn't work out that much better. Quit music. Ended up working for a trading company who transferred me back to Japan. And then in, I guess, 1998, maybe 99, I thought this internet thing sounded sort of interesting. So quit my job, started my first company, sold that, started another one. And then it's been sort of, rinse, wash, repeat.
I guess the COVID regulations really left a mark on everyone.
Yes.
um, that's pretty fascinating that you come from music and you moved to startups. What kind of music did you play back then?
Well, I mean, as a pro, I'd play anything they'd pay me to play. I mean, I was not picky. Um, Given the choice, I really loved sort of like 1960s R&B, Marvin Gaye, Ray Charles, that kind of thing.
Mm.
But when they brought me to Japan, it was sort of the stereotypical late 80s, early 90s electro pop type of thing.
Ah,
Hmm.
okay. So the
So, what
music.
instrument did you play, or did you do some vocals, or?
I'm a singer, vocal arranger, play guitar, a little bit of keyboards.
Nice,
All right.
nice.
We should
You're
have
more
brought
on
you on
the
as a singer.
more on the acoustic or electric side.
Again, like I've made more money kind of playing electric. I guess I sort of prefer acoustic, but
Hmm.
when you're trying to feed yourself, you can't be too picky.
Hmm. So when
You
you
can
came to Japan after the record label signed you up, what was it like? Like, did you ever think at a point in your life you would move to Japan and you had to learn this language?
Yeah, well, kind of. I mean, after I graduated university, I sort of told, yeah, I told the whole world that, hey, I'm going to Japan. I'm going to be a rock star, and it didn't quite work out. Um, so I don't know. I wasn't really thinking long term at that point. I was just taking things a few years at a time. So yeah, it looks like I've had this really crazy, chaotic career, but when you compress 30, 40 years into a few minutes, it sounds that way. But it was really kind of linear. One thing really did logically lead to another.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I was wondering, how was it for you actually going to Japan back then? I mean, we have just been in Japan, this like 6 years, 7 years ago, roughly. But I assume it was such a different time that for foreigners, it might have been even more challenging to assimilate into the Japanese society. How has it been for you?
Yeah, I've never actually. It's funny. I've never really been someone who thought about assimilating per se. I sort of want to do my own thing, and I don't really want to bother people. And I kind of want to be left alone to do it. And Japan's a good place to do that, actually. If you just kind of follow the rules and people let you do your own thing. But yeah, in the late 80s, it was different. Some things were much harder, some things were much easier. Um,
Mhm.
there were far fewer foreigners in Japan at that point.
Mhm.
So you got a lot of extra attention, both good and bad. Um, you got the police would come up to you constantly just because they'd never seen a foreigner in these parts before. And
Okay.
uh, I actually discovered that I could stop babies from crying. I would
Okay.
seriously, there'd be this like, where, like, huh? I don't know how many times it happened. I'm like, all right, this is ridiculous. Yeah, it was a different world. But then it's I think it was much harder to actually assimilate at that point. You had to kind of accept your otherness. So I think now a lot of Japanese companies are very welcoming to foreigners who um, to join management. I mean, I worked at TEPCO for a couple of years, and there was no problem with me being a foreigner from anyone I ever saw, or even not even implied.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So in that sense, it's a lot easier to assimilate and get by now than it was before.
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah. And was it difficult to sort of, I mean, did you struggle on a personal level in your first couple of years in that sort of environment? I mean, did you ever experience some sort of loneliness during that time?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I was what 21, 22, so I didn't know what the hell was going on in the world. I found myself literally on the other side of the world, and it was a strange mix of boredom and really exciting times and very lonely times and uh, eh, other times like dancing at Juliana's until the first trains, and it was a lot of ups and downs, mostly
Yeah.
ups. It was a lot of fun.
You said that you left Japan twice for good. So, what were your thoughts in the end actually to return after those times?
Yeah, I've never been. I was never one of those people who like passionately loved Japan and wanted to stay here. I mean, it's a lovely place. Don't get me wrong. I enjoy it. If I didn't, I guess I would have left a long time ago. But it's always been like something else has come up, some new exciting project, a new job, and then I ended up staying a little longer. And the first time I ever really consciously decided to stay in Japan because I wanted to be in Japan specifically, I think was I guess it's about 6 years ago now, and the company I was leading the market entry for, Silicon Valley startup that kind of pivoted out from underneath me, closed a lot of the overseas offices, and they were talking about moving me to San Francisco to take another role. And I just sort of decided, no, I think Japan is going to be more interesting in the next 10 years than San Francisco is going to be in the next 10 years. And we're
Hmm.
six years through that. So I got 4 years to figure out whether that call was the right one or the wrong one.
Hmm.
I'm interested. 6 years ago, you also, roughly 6 years ago, you also founded Disrupting Japan, the
Those are
podcast.
not unrelated.
Okay.
Yeah, it was one of these things. Like I said, I'd lost my job. Uh, the company left Japan, so I had to figure out what to do, what I wanted to do with myself. And Disrupting Japan, it actually started just as a hobby.
Mhm.
I thought I'd sit down with some of my founder friends and chat about startups. I mean, which technically is still what it is, but I honestly never thought it would have more than 100, 200 listeners. Startups in Japan, Japanese innovation, it's such a niche topic. And especially at that time, podcasts were not nearly as big as they are today.
Hmm.
So I was just, you know, totally overwhelmed by the attention that the podcast has got.
Hmm. And like, what was your first, sort of engagement with startups in general? I mean, you had a lot of experience, with music, but what was the first time you started getting into that industry?
Yeah, it really was 1998. I guess a little before then, I was just I was still working at that trading company doing technology stuff. I developed an inventory management system for them, and I don't know. I was just feeling bored. I felt like I'd gone as far as I could at that company, and literally this internet thing was going all around me, and it's like, well, I want to be part of that. I want to do something with this.
Hmm.
So I quit that job and I didn't know what I wanted to do with it at first. So I started doing like a little bit of programming and web design. And in the late 90s, you could do that. It wasn't that hard, but there weren't that many people who could do it. And then a couple years later, I kind of figured out what I really wanted to do and where the market opportunity was. And I hired some more people and built this e-commerce platform. So it was really just like finding the opportunity and doing it.
And you started that e-commerce platform in Japan or somewhere else?
All my companies have been in Japan,
All of them. Okay.
all of them, everyone.
And and that was your first one. The first startup you did out of the four was the e-commerce platform.
Vanguard, it was an e-commerce company, and sold that to
Hmm.
Digital Garage a couple of years later.
Wow. Okay.
The tendency is, and this is something we'd go deeper in this episode, I assume, because you have quite definitely a different opinion on this. But Japan seems to be, yeah, well, back then I assume it was ahead of its time. But the environment for startups must have still be completely different compared to some places in America, let's say.
Yeah, it was horrible. No, no. I mean, the dot-com era, starting a company in Japan was just it was this terrible, stupid thing to do. Um, the you needed $100,000 to for the minimum capitalization. There was all kinds of restrictions on bankruptcy. It was hard to open a bank account as a foreign-owned company. It was crazy, and I didn't like consciously decide like, well, I want to start a startup. So where in the world should I be? I definitely would not have chosen Japan at that point.
Mhm.
But it really was more like, okay, with my life, I want to do something, right? I see an opportunity here, and to pursue that opportunity, I need to hire a few people and grow that. So it was really it wasn't so much a grand plan as it was just putting one foot in front of the other.
Mhm.
That's really interesting because that brings to mind one of our former guests, Miho Tanaka, who
Yeah.
sort of specializes in immigration law and is looking to make, international, entrepreneurs like make Japan startup scene more accessible by translating a lot of the, procedures. So I can't imagine what it was like for someone like you back in the day to sort of overcome those hurdles. What was that sort of like back then compared to now?
Well, I mean, honestly, the incorporation process, the fund, the getting the capitals together, it was definitely harder. But
Mhm.
even today, the percentage of effort in growing a business that's involved in that administrative stuff compared to like sales and building a customer base, the administrative stuff is just, it's a rounding error. You don't
Mhm.
notice it. I think the bigger effect actually has been sort of this social attitude towards startups have changed.
Mhm.
So, okay,
Okay.
so for example, when one of the first Japanese I ever wanted to hire, he was a new grad and he wanted to come work with us. He was a great fit. The company was about 15 people at this point, and his mom just said no.
Mhm.
And it wasn't that it was a small company. It wasn't that it was a foreign owned company. It was this whole new startup thing. And so I had to go and meet mom and explain to her what this was. And to her, it's like, okay, so you're getting this money from these people and you're going to sell it to other people for like 10 times more. It sounded like scammy or some kind of a con to her. And so I
Mhm.
walked her through it. I said, no, this is, and eventually mom was cool and he joined the company. But I don't have to do that anymore. People understand what startups are. Um,
S- So maybe, yeah, we can take this macro approach. How would you say that how has the startup world kind of changed from back then till now?
I think the most important thing, so like what Miho focuses on is really important. And so the changes in structures and laws have been hugely helpful. But I think the more important change has been a social awareness
Mm.
that startups are legitimate. And I think there's a couple of like key points in that. One was the movie. Do you remember The Social Network?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, not that great of a movie, really. But before that, no one in Japan really knew what a startup was. After that movie, people understood like, oh, that's a startup.
Mhm.
It's sort of like registered in the national consciousness. So
Mhm.
good, small step, improvement. And then we went through a period of about 5 or 6 years where government ministers and politicians were talking about how the NEETs, the not in employment, education, or training, were dragging the economy down and they needed to go get jobs. And then, really, one of the things that Prime Minister Abe did really well, he was a big supporter of startups and entrepreneurship. And yeah, there were some big programs and grants and things, but none of that money ever actually makes it to startups. They get sucked up by the contractors at higher levels.
Mhm.
But when the prime minister is giving a speech and he's saying that startups are the future of Japan and this is what the future economic growth depends on, the next day every CEO in the country is kind of going, okay, what are these startup things and why aren't we working with them?
Mhm.
Mm.
So there's been this massive legitimizing effect that is just wonderful. And so back at Vanguard in the late 90s, I couldn't work with a tier one company. I would have been pushed down through 3 or 4 levels of subcontractors.
Mhm.
But now, like every major company in Japan has a special team, at least one special team, focused on reaching out, working with startups, figuring out how they can adopt this innovation. So it's really amazing. It's a great time to be running a startup in Japan.
Mhm. Is that something you do as well in your current job?
Actually, run a startup?
Not run a startup, but like, actually supporting them?
Yeah, we can get to that. Yeah, sure. So one of the many my strange career twists. I'm currently the head of Google for Startups Japan. I've been doing this for about a year, and it's Google's approach to supporting the ecosystem, um, developing the community, working with individual founders, and it's just this huge honor. I about 2 years ago, Google reached out to me and basically, we love what you're doing. We think the work you're doing with the startup ecosystem in Japan is great. Would you be interested in doing that at Google? And I was like, yeah, that does sound interesting. So yeah, that's my day job.
Mhm.
Wow. No, that's really interesting about how, generally the social awareness of startups in Japan back then must was almost non-existent, that you had to explain the concept of it because it looked like some shady thing. How like do they
Yeah.
refer to startups with the foreign term? Do they say startup when
Startup,
they
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That's
And
actually something I was
yeah.
wondering about. Like defining startups even nowadays is quite difficult, but I can't imagine that actually defining a startup back then. Like it's a new term that has kind of popped up
It
somewhere.
is, and there are Japanese terms that I mean, they talk about like Chisho like SMBs, small medium enterprises. They have lots of Japanese terms to describe this, and the distinction really is not. There's not a firm distinction
Mm-hmm.
between the two. So
Right.
I tend to kind of categorize any company that is trying to double their growth, double their sales, do
Yeah.
50% year on year growth. I consider them like startup because that's how startups are thinking.
Mm.
Whether they've got venture financing, whether they're bootstrapping, whether they are a 200-year-old company trying to reinvent themselves, that fits my definition of startup, and I want to work with those guys.
I see.
So what kind of who are the kinds of people back then that were interested in getting into startups in Japan? Like who are the what are the profiles of the people that joined Vanguard, for instance, and what made them want to sort of pursue such a thing when it was so obscure at the time?
Um, well, I think there were two types of people starting companies. There were people with like really good pedigrees and connections, the Mikitani sons, who like started Rakuten about the same time.
Hmm.
Um, and they had the business connections, and it was a good, smart move for them to do so. And then there were people like me, both Japanese and foreign, that just we didn't have a whole lot of other options really. So this was our best avenue. So that's what we did. The people who came to work for me were it actually it was easy to recruit foreigners. Actually, no, it was easy to recruit foreigners and Japanese to work at startups back then. In a sense, it's easier then than it is now because software engineers in Japan, until very recently, and still at traditional companies, it's been considered kind of a blue collar job. It's not a respected profession in the way that hardware engineering is.
Hmm.
So there were all of these really amazing, talented engineers, these talented programmers. And I could just say, hey, look, this is going to be a whole lot more fun to work on. Don't you want to do something worthwhile with these talents of yours? And I can't pay as much, but I guarantee you'll enjoy it more. And yeah.
What attracted them? When it wasn't the salary, it was like the kind of the dynamic working environment, or
No, I mean, it's just the right person, the people you want. I mean, if someone is a really passionate engineer and they're being micromanaged by someone that just doesn't understand what they're doing, they're not respecting their work, yeah, they'll go to work somewhere where they have input, where they can drive decisions, where they can do meaningful work, where they can have like a direct connection with customers who appreciate their work.
Mhm.
Hugely rewarding.
Mm.
Um, Now it's actually a lot harder to recruit engineers
Yeah.
because engineers in Japan have a lot more power now, and they can go out and raise their own funds and start their own companies. So yeah, you got to have a better pitch to the programmers now than you did before,
Mm.
which is a
See,
great thing.
that is definitely a great thing, and I'm glad to hear that it's actually possible. I was wondering, I think shukatsu is a very traditional thing in Japan, and most graduates, I think they still want to work, for the big Japanese companies, or at least the ones who are well known. I mean, even in Japan, like Starbucks is a thing to actually work there part time, or some companies like McDonald's, where here they're kind of just part time jobs, but in Japan, they really matter what kind of part-time jobs they did because it will allow them to kind of show, oh, I've worked at Starbucks, so um, I might be more interested for or interesting for your company. So at Shukatsu, has it changed, or is it like that students are actually fresh graduates, are interested in starting their own companies or are interested in going into startups?
It is. I mean, so my friends constantly remind me that I do live in a bit of a bubble. Like the people around me are all startup people. So I mean, I
Right.
see this Japan as this amazing nation of innovators, but that's Tim's little bubble. Um, but no, there are a lot of people. Um, Now, whether you're talking about Japan or the US, the majority of new grads everywhere want to work for the big name companies. That doesn't
Hmm.
change. It skews a little more that way in Japan than in the US, say. But yeah, a lot more new grads are starting companies. And
Hmm.
in fact, one of the things that changed since I started disrupting Japan was in the early days. If you go back and listen to the first couple of years, I would always ask for the origin story
Hmm.
because people had these amazing stories of being opposed by their wife or their family, or one guy was actually homeless when he started his firm. Another guy actually had to like pawn his wife's jewelry. And he was, yeah, he was like, Tim, your startup's important, but man, there are some things you should just never do. Um, and now I've stopped asking the question because it's, I mean, unless I know for a fact there's some really interesting story, because almost always it's like, well, I had this idea and my friends and family were really supportive and I could get venture funding, so why not? And
Mhm.
that's great, but it makes for kind of boring podcasting. So yeah, I don't ask that anymore. Been a huge change,
What
and
kind of
only in like 6 years, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Like, have you seen other changes through disrupting Japan, or is there any story that kind of particularly for you pops out?
Uh, in terms of trends, I think um, the lack of an origin story is a trend. Another thing I noticed, and I've interviewed around 200 founders, so it's still like a relatively small data set. But one thing I have noticed is early on, it was the female founders, and there are a lot of women entrepreneurs in Japan. But the female founders I was interviewing, there were a lot of single women, a lot of single moms, but but not a whole lot of like happily married women with a supportive husband.
Hmm.
And that's changed. I run into more and more women founders who have a husband who thinks it's great that they're running a company and are supportive, and so I don't know if that's a societal shift or just my chance encounters, but I I I think it's a good sign.
Mhm. Mhm. You are actually also part of, I don't remember the name, but the Startup Women's Lab. Is that right?
Yes, Women's Startup Lab.
Women's Startup Lab. What do you actually do there? And
I'm an
yeah.
advisor, and I wish I did more. I just in my copious free time. No, Ari Horie started this project. Oh wow, actually, around the same time I was starting disrupting Japan, a little bit before, and we've known each other for longer than either of us probably cares to admit. But she's really working in San Francisco to empower women, to teach them um, kind of skills to survive in the startup world.
Mhm.
And she's been doing some programs in Japan too over the years. So I'll give advice, I'll mentor, um, that kind of thing. But it's a great organization.
I'm actually quite fascinated about that subject also because we've had lots of female entrepreneurs in the past episodes, and it is a sign from what you said, right? There is some kind of mindset shift right there in Japan where um, women also have now the chance to actually do a startup, despite the fact that this is the outside perspective of Japan, or the international perspective on Japan, is that it's a very traditional country where women tend to be still the housewives in some ways, and the man is going to work and getting the income. And there's still, I think, also quite some pressure from the society itself or from the families to do exactly that. So we were quite happy to see that this is shifting and changing a lot. So
It is. But I mean, again, this is sort of like Tim in his bubble seeing these great innovators. But when you look at the actual data, the participation rate is still pretty low in Japan. It's one of the lowest in the world, which is a
Mhm.
shame, or lowest in the developed world anyway.
Mhm.
So, what kind of demographic makes up most of the startup and entrepreneurs in Japan? Is it more of an international audience, or is it still, predominantly Japanese men, for instance? What have you observed?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, it's primarily Japanese men. There are a lot of foreigners there. There's obviously more Japanese women than there are foreign men and women combined. Just because there aren't that many foreigners in Japan, but the foreigners in Japan play a much bigger role in the startup ecosystem than they do as a percentage of the population. But I don't think that's unique to Japan. We see the same thing in Silicon Valley, where some of the most important companies were started by non-Americans, by people who came to America. The Indian community has been hugely influential in Silicon Valley, for example. So I think it's maybe a combination of like what I was talking about before is foreigners have fewer options than Japanese do. We didn't go to the right universities or have the social connections, so we're more likely to lean towards entrepreneurship. And I also think anyone willing to uproot themselves and move to another country, speak another language is got a little higher tolerance for risk than the average person, most likely.
I think that's a good that's a good point, and also something we've talked about before or kind of touched upon. But I remember I watched a video before this where you talked about the perspective that Japan is a very risk averse country. It's very much not rejecting, but risk and innovation are two things which kind of Japan stands out as something it doesn't want to touch, and the society seems to be the same way. But you disputed that. What is your opinion on that?
I do. I mean, at a high level, it's not wrong to say Japan's risk averse, but I think there's a simpler way of looking at it. So people like to say, oh, well, there's more startups now, so Japanese people are becoming less risk averse. And I don't think that's a useful way to look at it. I think it's simpler than that. It's just a matter of risks and rewards. So if you looked at a new Todai grad, say back in '88 when I first came to Japan, he had two options. He could go work for a big company or he could go start a startup. If he went to work for a big company, he was guaranteed steady promotions, big expense account, prestige, job for life. It was all reward, no risk. Starting a company, there was no equity financing available. Bankruptcy laws were really, really strict. There was very minimal social acceptance. So it was like all risk and very little reward. So yeah, of course, everyone made the rational choice to go work for large companies. But today, that equation is different, right? There's no more lifetime employment. There's no more guaranteed promotions. You could work for a big company, they could let you go after 20 years. But on the flip
Oh,
side,
really? Okay.
sure, yeah.
Yeah,
Unless you're
that's
working
been
for the
happening.
government, you do not have lifetime employment in Japan anymore. Um, on the other side, like starting a startup, you can raise capital. You don't need to use your own money. The bankruptcy laws have um, been simplified a lot since then, and the M&A is becoming more common, and IPOs are easier now than they were before. So starting a startup has become less risky and more rewarding. Going to a big company has become more risky and less rewarding. So people are naturally doing the perfectly logical thing of starting more startups. So I just think like any individual as humans, we are totally irrational as individuals, but in like large groups, we tend to be pretty rational.
Hmm.
I was wondering actually about that. So if the elevator shiki, kind of like they call it elevator shiki, right? I think is gone, then it really is an incentive for Japanese or for anyone actually to go into these or start their own business in Japan.
Mhm.
Mm. But
Well,
are
some of
they?
the other, oh, sorry, like some of the other changes in that, I mean, now, I mean, compared to the US or Europe, it's still much more structured and seniority based. It's just not nearly as strict as it was 30, 40 years ago. But companies are hiring people more mid career, which they never used to do. It's possible to change jobs. Especially, in fact, if you have a skill, if you're a programmer, a designer, sales, um, it's very easy to change jobs at least until your mid 30s.
Hmm.
So it's definitely changing here.
How is it for the other side though? Like, are there lots of kind of angel investors? Are large companies actually interested in startups, like buying them or seeing them as competition?
Yeah, that is interesting. So I think in Japan, the corporate venture capital, m- most large companies in Japan have some form of corporate venture capital or some startup outreach program. However, most of these CVCs they don't lead rounds, so they won't decide on their own to invest, but they will follow on with a more traditional Japanese VC partner.
Mhm.
Um, in terms of M&A, it's definitely picked up. Strategic M&A is still new. In like 2000, M&A was always distressed assets. It was companies that you could pick up for fire sale prices. So strategic M&A is new, but there's more and more of it happening. There's been some very high profile acquisitions of startups. It's another thing. I've worked with a number of big companies on this, and I'd say everyone's heart's in the right place. There is still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of like integrating the cultures and making it work. But hey, step by step.
Hmm.
Mm.
Just a disclaimer, M&A is merger and acquisition.
Mergers and
So
acquisitions. Sorry.
yeah, oh good, oh good. I think some might not actually understand it. um, but yeah, I'm still wondering if actually big companies kind of understand that the Japanese business world is changing. Because I feel like these Japanese companies, particularly the ones who are driving the economy, right? Most of them are not like large corporations like Toyota, which has been, or Canon or whatever, who have been driving innovation anyway since years. Most of the Japanese companies who are holding up the economy are quite small and medium-sized companies, and they tend to be quite traditional. I mean, I heard even stories that some of them still used till a few years ago, maybe even now, paper instead of computers, and so many different areas in their departments. So I wonder if that actually, if this innovation or if this startup world, which drives the development of the country, is actually going as far as taking those structures apart.
I mean, I think it will. I don't think we're there yet. This is one of the things I'm really hoping to see. So, Japan's small, medium businesses make up the bulk of the employment, the bulk of the GDP, but they're sort of like the neglected middle child. So, the large enterprises are the ones with the political influence, with the cash reserves that really set the narrative for the country.
Mhm.
And then they've like the little brother, the youngest child, these startups that are doing all these cool, crazy things that the press love to talk about, and they get all this attention. And then you've got these like SMBs who just like quietly go ahead and hold up the economy. Um, I haven't seen a lot of adoption yet. A few isolated cases that I think are really amazing, like Hoso and the Go On project in Kyoto. But I think that Japan's SMBs have this incredible manufacturing base of very high technology because they used to be part of this Keiretsu supply chain. And if they can innovate with that, if they can turn that into productization, into like test marketing, I think it could be a huge driver of innovation and growth in Japan. But this is like Tim dreaming about what's going to happen 10 years from now. I wouldn't even say we're at the first steps of that yet.
We'll definitely come towards the end of these episodes to your dreams and wishes. But for now, maybe you can quickly tell us what are these two projects you've mentioned? There was Hoso and
Hoso is an SMB. They're a 330-year-old company. They make
okay.
kimono silk.
Okay.
And a few years back, they reinvented themselves by dedicating like 20% of the revenues to innovative projects. And they've been working with like Dior, with Panasonic, with like trying to do different things with fabrics and textiles. Really cool stuff. And Goon is a Kyoto based consortium of SMB manufacturers trying to do this, trying to do reinvent themselves, trying to get traditional businesses to do cool things.
You've mentioned actually that before already at the very beginning. But are there actually many companies who try to reinvent themselves in Japan?
No, there's painfully few, but there are a few.
And are startups kind of pushing still, that they change
No,
their mindset?
it's actually they exist almost in two different worlds. There's very little overlap between the SMB world and the startup world. And I think there's a lot they could learn from each other, but there really are they're two different groups right now.
But sorry, I know that I've asked a lot of questions now. So
No. You asked a lot of the
Last
questions that I was thinking of, but what I wanted to really delve deeper into is just about what kind of innovation do you think startups in Japan are pushing the most? And do you think, like, for what international media sort of portrays as a country that's sort of stagnating in innovation, do you think startups are filling in that gap, and to what extent?
That's a really good question. So I think some of the things I find most fascinating from Japanese startups are in their approach to um, user interface, the interaction between people and machines. Whether that's kind of like a minimalist approach coming from Mui Labs, or something like Yukai Engineering, which is just these crazy robotics. But I think, and in fact, one of the projects that I'm going to reboot in my copious free time was the Evocatives Machines project, which is a different way of people interacting with machines. And it is, so Japan, the difference between US and Japan, the US tends to view particularly robots, automation in a very confrontational way, a very threatening way. And this is not like a recent phenomenon. This goes back to like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to it's the way we view automation.
We've heard this before on the show as well from a couple of
Yeah.
people. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
quite interesting.
And in Japan, it isn't that way. It never has been. And I talk with people who are in like industrial automation. They'll say that in the US, people will sabotage the robots. They won't give them any feedback. It's just really hostile. And I think it's a different perception, and a lot of it has to do with the way the interface is designed. And actually, if you look at how interface compare like Japanese, like Pepper, this really cute, somewhat androgynous little robot, right? To the nightmare machines coming out of Boston Dynamics. You know, I mean, they've got this whole Terminator vibe going, and that is a conscious design choice, right? You know,
there you go. There's Pepper.
there you go. How cute is that?
It's very cute. It's true.
Yeah, no, certainly. And even with something like the robot hotel in Tokyo, that's something that's a lot of international media, the perception is like this is really freaky and it's so disturbing. But
And
I'm sure
I hate that is like Japan's face to the world, because the Japanese thought that was freaky as hell too. That was some serious uncanny valley stuff going on there. So it lasted a very short period of time because the Japanese guests were just creeped out by the whole thing as well. And they've changed it now, so they're not people; they're dinosaur robots.
Right. Yeah. I saw something like that. Yeah. Not sure if that makes the situation better though.
Apparently, it does.
Okay.
But no, there is this uncanny valley, which is very real when something seems close, but close to human, but just a little off. We get really freaked out by it.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I have seen these robots in Japan, or there's I think one in Odaiba as well, like a receptionist or something. I believe it was in Odaiba somewhere, but I found it a bit creepy because you look at it and you think, oh, it gives me like a feeling of that there's a human sitting there, but it's actually not a human.
No,
There's
totally
something
creepy.
missing. Yeah,
It's
it
totally creepy. I mean, like Pepper is not creepy. It doesn't look human. It's not trying to look human.
mm.
Atlas does not look creepy. Atlas just looks terrifying.
But
Yeah.
you've mentioned lots of robotics now and technology, and I think from the outside world, Japan is definitely has been always famous for tech. But are there also like startups that kind of change like certain other aspects of the society in some ways
Or
that
like
have
maybe
nothing?
addressing social issues in Japan, for instance.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
I could give you. I think there's a lot. There aren't any I can list up that have had the big impacts of something like Google or Facebook. But there are some startups doing some pretty amazing things. So like Smart News, they're
Mm.
actually in the U.S. now too. And what they do, yeah, they're another news feed. There's a ton of them, but what they do, and I really respect, is they make sure that their news does not filter based on opinion or point of view in
Hmm.
any way. It ranks solely based on quality.
Mm.
And when they launched in the U.S., they caught a lot of a lot of shit for this. People were like, "What the hell is this Fox News article doing in my feed?" Or like, "What the hell? I don't want Mother Jones showing up." And yeah, but they stuck to their guns, and they're like, "No, no, this is important. This is how we need to exist as a society." And I think that is huge. And I'm hoping that regardless of how much money they make, I think like they have a lot to teach American society, and I hope that catches on.
Hmm. Yeah,
Mm.
Smart News is the application that sort of combines different sources and sort of gives you this plethora of perspectives on a news story, right? Yeah, I
Yep.
believe I've used it on my phone before. Was that a Japan startup? I did
Yeah.
not know.
Yep.
Wow.
They've been on the show. Well, like 6 years ago. They were one of the early guests when they were just starting their U.S. expansion.
Wow, that's amazing. I did not know that. I always had the sense that because even when you sort of access the application, there's a strong sort of focus on American news. So I
Well,
never actually
you got to
imagined they
do
would come
that,
from
right? I mean,
Japan.
if you're after German customers, you want to look like a German company. If you're after American customers, you want to look like
Mm.
an American company.
Yeah.
That's a good point. See, that was something we discussed in a different episode as well. But what is your perspective on this whole thing that Japanese tend to actually trust Japanese products a little bit more than from or products that are foreign? In this case, well, the products are definitely or the services are produced in Japan, but if a foreigner is behind it, do they gain the same trust? What would you say?
Okay, there's two things to tease apart in there. So I think the Japanese do have greater trust for Japanese products and services than they do foreign, but I think that is based in fact to a large extent. Um, Japanese consumer demands are really high, and the stuff that gets imported from China or like most of the stuff coming in from the U.S. now is like still coming from China originally.
Yeah.
Um, it's the whole like U.S. philosophy of like, oh, if it doesn't work, just return it. We'll send you a new one. Like that doesn't cut it in Japan. Like having it something wrong is a problem.
Mhm.
So I think there is a real basis in truth for the quality of Japanese products. On the B2B side, the business side, selling to enterprises, there's definitely a bias against foreign companies, and again, well deserved because there's a long history of foreign tech companies coming into Japan and saying, "Hey, use this software, standardize on this process, we'll solve all these problems for you. Yeah, we're going to be here forever. We've just hired 10 people," and then pulling out like 3 years later. So
Hmm.
yeah, there's skepticism, but it's it's well deserved skepticism.
Definitely, it sounds valuable to some extent, but it definitely makes it then also harder, I guess, for foreigners to start up, or might actually, when they hear this, say, "Oh, maybe I shouldn't actually do it here, the business."
Well, what
So,
I tell everyone,
mm,
whether they're starting a company here or whether they're doing a market entry, is one of the things you have to do is you've got to signal your commitment to the market,
mm,
because everyone's default assumption is that you're going to leave when things get rough.
mm,
That you're not
Mm.
that's like your null hypothesis. That's what you're starting with. So you need to demonstrate that that's not the case. And you can do that by hiring staff. You can do that by partnering with a large Japanese company. So the expectation is that that company has vetted you and that you'll be there for the long haul. Um, you can do that like I have by being in Japan for 30 years. You know? So people finally accepted, like, oh, so you'll probably be here in a couple of years. I'm like, yeah. But
Yeah,
no, the
probably.
signal and the commitment's important. Yeah.
And are there some incentives kind of like from the government side as well?
Visas have gotten a lot easier to get.
Mhm.
It's there's been tax breaks. Yeah, there have been incentives. But I don't know how much that plays into it. I think more of the social attitudes and the general business sentiment matters far, far more than specific laws. Although, I mean, the reforms have been great. They were, well done and streamlined a lot of important things. But the the social acceptance, the business acceptance of startups and innovation has been far more important in driving the growth of the ecosystem.
Hmm. That's really interesting. And I just want to go back to, there was a point you made earlier in the episode in relation to that about software in Japan and how it's sort of been slow compared to the hardware side. Are startups sort of, looking to address that? Are they, do you see them as a potential thing to accelerate software development and improve that, social stigma towards software in general in Japan?
Oh yeah, very much. It's already happening. And in fact, like a disrupting Japan episode I've been working on the last couple of years. I'll get it out there. One of this history of software development in Japan. Um, I think that because for so long software development was this blue collar job, there was no real career path. Um, Japanese software was pretty bad, quite frankly. And then around really with the advent of cloud computing, starting a company became so inexpensive. And at the same time, there was a lot of venture capital available. So all these engineers could quit their companies and start these projects. And there's amazing stuff going on. But I think Japanese engineering is still, it's still catching up. They were kind of handicapped by like 20 years of not really being state of the art. And they've had a lot of catching up to do in the last 10 years. So on average, I'd say that the software developers you'll find in Tokyo are world class. They're just as good as you'd find in Silicon Valley on average. But the very, very top, that's Japan's not quite in that very top range yet.
When I hear this, actually, it makes me think of two things. So when they have like excellent graduates, for example, from university, wouldn't it make more sense for them as well to go abroad and to kind of work somewhere like, let's say, in what some of the startups hubs that are internationally kind of renowned, because they're particularly in India, I think there has been this kind of brain drain, that's what they call it. And I assume in Japan that's actually not the case, that there's a lot of brain drain and a lot of Japanese going abroad because they have been risk averse, kind of, no?
I think there's a little bit of it. But I think now it's not so much risk averse. I think like 10 years ago, we saw a lot more Japanese going to Silicon Valley because the options in Japan weren't as good. But now, if you're a computer science major at a top school and you've got an idea for a startup, your school probably has a startup program. They probably have an affiliated VC. The Japanese market is big. So there's less need to go outside. It's that back to that risk and reward equation again, right?
For the startup world in general, what kind of wishes or dreams do you actually have for the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
I think things are going on the right track. I'd like to see. Well, I'll do two. I think from the startup side, from the founder side, I'd like to see more global ambitions, um, and it's inching that way. But I think that even though the Japanese market is big, it's not big enough to really be a unicorn farm. The only way
Mm.
you can really grow to global scale is to have a global company, and more Japanese are doing it, but it's not as many as I'd like to see. Um, so the trends are in the right direction; they're just slow. On the
Mm.
other side, what I would love to see is I would love to see a Japanese version of DARPA. So DARPA is America's it's an innovation program run by the Department of Defense, and it's been responsible for touch screens and Ethernet, and a lot of the Boston Dynamics stuff all came out of DARPA. Um, I mean, Silicon Valley is entwined with DARPA. So much of that technology came out of that. And the beauty of DARPA is it targets a goal. It says we want a solution for X. Here are the parameters, and whether you are Raytheon or whether you're you know two friends working in a garage, it's open to everyone.
Mhm.
And I think Japan needs that. And it wouldn't, obviously, it wouldn't be defense oriented.
Mhm.
But right now, so much of their innovation programs are really top down, centrally controlled. They decide who's working on what parts. But I think Japan would really benefit by having a program that's just like, hey, here's the problem. What solutions do you have? Open to anybody.
Mm. Mm. You know, I found that quite interesting to hear because that is behind the Defense Department. Because Defense Department is, of course, A, very interested in the security part, but B, well, not B, but it has then for the security part, national security part, has very much moved into the cyberspace, let's say. And therefore, B, of course, the Defense Department is interested at having local projects in order to kind of increase the digital sovereignty of a country, because otherwise you get dependent on, well, we have the big five who have basically spread their services around the world, and lots of people actually just because it's so easy, they're so used by everyone, and they're very like well, they're easy to use and they work fantastically, that they just jump on it without actually thinking that there are alternatives which are not taking away some of the data and bring them across to the American service, for example. So a very interesting point. But you've also mentioned the global ambition of Japanese companies, and that's something actually we haven't touched upon. It's something I haven't thought about. But the startups or the companies in general who are very young in Japan, they stay in the national market, or do they? I guess that's what you tried to say. They don't really have ambition to go somewhere else in different markets.
Yeah, and I don't have a percentage. I'm not going to try to guess at the percentage of this, but Japan is a big market, so it is safe. You can get to a safe, low, medium value IPO just by focusing on the Japanese market. And a lot of Japanese VCs discourage their companies from doing market entries overseas because it's risky, it's expensive, it requires a lot of capital, it can really screw up or delay an IPO. So there's a lot of pressure for Japanese to just focus on Japan, and more are going overseas.
Mhm.
So it's like I say, the trends are in the right direction, but I just like to see more,
Hmm.
more, faster.
And
Startup
what
speeds,
sort
right?
of
Double it every year.
and what sort of implications do you think the pandemic has had on the startup ecosystem? And do you think it's hindered that growth to a certain extent?
No, it hasn't. I've got to say, I was surprised at this. There was a little bit of a drop in the amount of investments made, but not much. They're up. The VCs have been able to close their own rounds of follow-on funding, so it doesn't look like we're going to have a dip in funding this year either. So it didn't really have that much of a top-down impact. I mean, it did, but not nearly as much as anyone was expecting. Naturally, med tech companies focused on working from home, remote learning, things like that became suddenly a very hot investment area. But I think that pendulum will swing like back really quickly once we get the vaccines in more arms.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
do you think that they were, I mean, judging by what you're saying, would you think that they were more sort of adaptable in that sort of response, in that crisis response, versus, more traditional hierarchical companies in Japan?
Well, startups, yeah, of course they were, because I mean they're smaller, they're
Hmm.
more agile. But the thing I like to point out, and I have to continuously point out to some of my larger enterprise clients, is so it's not like these startups suddenly develop these products to take advantage of the market opportunities that came up in the pandemic. These were companies that had products in the market already. They had this vision of what the world could be, how their product would fit in, and then the world changed and they were ready to capitalize on it. And so, like, people always ask me, like, well, what are going to be the hot trends in startups in Japan? What sectors? It's like, I don't know. I don't have to know. The point is, if you've got an ecosystem, you've got thousands and thousands of companies exploring every little possibility and every niche. And it's like this national research and development lab.
Mhm.
And when something crazy happens, when a pandemic hits, suddenly it's just like this deep well of technology you can dive into. And like, oh, well, there's these companies have been thinking about telemedicine for the last 5 years and they've got a product in the market. Great. Let's use that now.
Mhm.
And it's an amazing tool.
Mhm. Maybe finally, do you have any kind of final message you want to share on the Japanese startup world or the Japanese business world? Maybe particularly to people to the outside, like who live not in Japan, who don't experience it on a daily basis, but kind of are interested in it?
Well, yeah, that's something. Well, can I plug the podcast?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, sure.
so no. This is my labor of love, disrupting Japan. So I mean,
Yeah.
this is what we talk about. Used to be every week, now it's every month. It's about what it's like being a innovator in a culture that really prizes conformity, and it's a each episode is a story about Japanese society told through the lens of a startup. And yeah, I think the world has a lot to learn from what's going on in Japan.
Mm.
And that's my way of like trying to get the message out.
Mm.
Well,
So
thank
you've
you
heard
very
it.
much, Tim. No, you've heard it, ladies and gentlemen. There's no better place, honestly, to learn about the Japanese startup ecosystem than the Disrupting Japan podcast. Take my word for it. And certainly do check out the podcast. You can check it out on the website disruptingjapan.com or on your favorite podcast app. I'm pretty sure you're on all the popular ones, Tim. Uh,
I try to be everywhere.
he's everywhere,
It's hard to
folks.
keep up these days, though, honestly.
Fair, that's true. Yes.
Well, no, and what I really admire is that your podcast is available in not just audio but text as well on the website, which you can just you can access so much valuable insights either in your preferred way in your in articles or through the podcast itself. So that must be a lot of hard work, and I will commend you for that, and as well as 6 long successful years with the Disrupting Japan, and hopefully many more.
And so
Thanks very much.
consistently as well, like really the format of the show as well has been very consistent and not a lot. There are lots of podcasts who can't follow that consistency, to be honest, and that's why it's so nice. Like when you jump into the episode, you're kind of like, oh yeah, this is disrupting Japan. You kind of immediately know.
Thank you. I love doing it. I really do.
And we
Well,
love listening to it. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone who tuned in. If you liked this episode and you're watching on YouTube, give it a like. If not, give it a dislike, whatever you'd like. But I hope you don't give it a dislike because it was a fantastic conversation. Either way, subscribe to us on your favorite podcast app as well. You can find the links as well as for Disrupting Japan in the description. And have a lovely Saturday, everyone. This has been Tobiro signing off.
thanks, Tim, for being there.
It's been an absolute pleasure.